All right, so for today's class, we're still looking at solving equations, but we're gonna look at something different today. From the success criteria, it says, be able to classify imaginary numbers. And we talk about imaginary numbers, we talk about negative numbers underneath the square root sign, okay? All right, so sometimes, we work out some questions and then there's a negative number underneath the square root sign, all right? So that's where we're gonna start from. So say for instance, we had a square root -4, okay? First thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna break this up and make it the square root of -1 times the square root of +4. Zoom. Now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna introduce this new term, I. In mathematics, I is equal to the square root of -1. So wherever I see the square root of -1, I can replace it with I. So with this case, I do equal, this right here is I, and the square root of 4 is 2. So my answer would be 2I. Zoom. Let's do one more example and then we'll go through a full question. So if I have the square root of -16, I'm going to go ahead and split these two into -16 positive and square root of -1. Multiply. So then square root of 16 is 4. Square root of 16, it's a perfect square. And then the square root of -1 is I. So my answer is 4I. I, because it's imaginary. Imaginary. I, because it's imaginary. Imaginary meaning it is imaginary because we cannot find the square root of a negative number. So we replace it with I. If we have one that's not a perfect square, which like the square root of -17, I'm going to split it up. Square root of 17 times the square root of -1, right? So then this is equal to -1 is I, we know that, but we can't necessarily find the square root of 17. We're going to get some decimals because it's not a perfect square. So we're going to leave it as square root 17 times I. Let's do one more example. Square root of 24, -24. I'm going to split this up. 24 times square root of -1. I, this new variable, is equal to square root of -1. So since I've already split them up, my answer would be square root of square root of 24 times I, because that's square root of -1 is I. All right, so we're going to work this one question that's right here. X squared plus 3 equals 2. I'm going to put it up here so that we have more space. So in order for me to solve this, it's asking me for X. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do the additive inverse and get rid of that 3. So -3 on both sides. So X squared is equal to -1. Now I have to do the square root to get rid of the square. I have to do the square root to get rid of the square. Let's use this color. Square root, they're inverses. So X is equal to the square root of -1. Whoa, which is?
Oh, I have a question.
-1, we could say x is equal to I, because we know square root of -1 is I. Make sense? All right, last example. Just like any other problem we'll be solving, we do, let's resume recording. I do the additive inverse. So I minus 10 on both sides, right? Which gives me 2x squared is equal to -3. And then now I have to do the multiplicative inverse, bam. Divide both sides by 2. So x squared is equal to -3/2. I'm going to bring this up here to continue. Now, in order to get rid of the square, I have to do the square root. Whatever you do on one side, you do it to the other side. So x is equal to the square root of -3/2, right? But we can't really find the square root of a negative number, so let's go ahead and split this up. 3/2 times the square root of -1. So x is equal to the square root of 3/2 times I. All right, so that's just a quick example of how we use the letter I to represent the square root of -1. If we go back to our success criteria that we looked at over here, is really understanding how to classify imaginary numbers when we're solving these equations with square roots and squares.